Hello and welcome to the latest Blind Spot podcast. Sorry, we're an hour and 15 minutes late. We are trying to do these regularly at the same time. Anyway, today we're joined by Ben Munster, who is coming live from none other than, can I declare where you are, Ben?
Holy See itself.
The Holy See is he's actually literally in the Vatican.
He's holy.
From the Sistine Chapel.
So he's in Rome.
We should probably talk a little bit, like catch everybody up, because I think almost nobody's aware of what's going on, to be honest.
Yes. So Josh, why don't you do the ultimate sort of recap of what we want to talk about?
Okay, so this went about a year ago. Ratzinger gave a publication. Ratzinger, the former pope, the one who abdicated, gave a publication to his publisher and told them not to publish it until his death. So he died on December 31st, and they published. I think there's 3 volumes came out. Am I right about that, Ben?
3 volumes.
3 books. I've heard there's 3 books.
Well, the one I read was 16 chapters in one book, and of which.
But I heard the publisher has 3 books total they're publishing. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I read on the first day.
Well, Ben is here to debunk a lot of the nonsense that's going around about this, because it turns out some of this isn't as repressed
revelatory
as some others have been saying.
So in the book, he asserts basically that the seminaries in, it sounds like Germany and I think in the US, have turned into basically gay brothels, and that there's a huge number of bishops that do not actually accept the faith anymore, and basically are not really Christian, God-believing, Jesus-believing Catholics. So it's sort of a description of corruption, but this is, and it's not making a lot of news anywhere in the world. There's a lot of critiques of local, particularly Catholic media, seeming to black out the documents and such. So we shall see.
But Ben, you've been looking at the tweets that made this go semi-viral in very specific areas. So what was the tweet that really sent Tradcaf Twitter mad this week? Because
like Junseth said, there's this perception that Benedict was sort of secretly railing against these, gay seminarians and secret homosexual societies inside the Vatican, corrupting it from the inside. But if you actually look at what's been tweeted, there's one quote, which is in the context of a quite long, discursive, quite scholarly chapter by Benedict on just the general sort of decadence of the church. He mentions in passing gay priests. He says club homosessuale, and then moves on to another thing that he says is wrong. Priests living with married lay people, for instance, in the same seminary. But he doesn't qualify the gay comment at all, and this kind of indicative of the general thrust of his sort of book is either old essays that were just sort of compiled into an anthology, or sort of personal, him personally redressing various grievances that have come up in the past, which actually don't bear at all on the homosexual clubs, or Francis being a secret funder of woke causes, or any of this stuff. There's basically none of the stuff that has been sort of sold to us by sort of the Tradcats are actually in the book itself, if you actually read it.
But is it your presumption that these are basically just his already disclosed views on stuff then?
It's not my presumption. It's so to step back. So you've got these people like Pope_head and Michael Knowles, who was a Daily Wire commentator. He's a Tradcath's sort of ally of Ben Shapiro. They're spinning this as if it's some kind of secret plot. The things that Benedict was too scared to say while he was alive because of the sort of woke St. Francis clique that would have gone out, that would have come for him. And so there's all this stuff about the gay clubs and whatever. But in reality, having read the book, right, that comment about, you know, gay clubs or whatever, it was published originally in the Corriere della Sera, which is an Italian daily, in 2019, and it was that one comment published, you know, 4 years ago now, basically, almost 4 years ago, that has basically just been the source of most of the sort of, you know, outcry. And then they're spinning the mainstream media silence. First, it doesn't really exist. The Times did a short story about, like, there was one comment that Rat Singer did make, which was fresh, right? Which was him talking about how he didn't want to publish the book until after he died because certain German critics who would have made his, you know, caused a lot of trouble.
Do we know?
There's nothing.
Do we know who he means by the German critics? Is like what? Any idea?
Well, I know that there are certain sort of there's a sort of separatist movement kind of within the German church. They're doing their own synod, which is like a kind of gathering of the faithful where they sort of can consider new doctrine or whatever. And I know that Francis himself has criticized that. And I think Benedict was maybe perceived as being either too mute towards Francis's certain reforms Francis did or whatever. But there's definitely a lot of kind of opprobrium towards him in Germany, whether from conservatives who wish he were more conservative or liberals who think he's, like, you know, not standing up against the conservatives. So there's a ton of tension there. But that comment about how he sort of basically, whenever he says anything, it provokes a murderous outcry in Germany. That was the only comment, the only sort of fresh comment in the book, which was quoted by any of the people spinning this as like a huge scandal. But again, but it was really, it doesn't amount to anything. I mean, it's kind of fair enough, isn't it? Like, in his position as Pope Emeritus, he didn't want to stir the pot. I guess he is kind of doing it posthumously. But yeah.
He was also a little sensitive. I always got the sense that he was a little sensitive, and
yeah, you get the sense he's a timid sort. He doesn't really want to cause too much trouble. I mean, so there have been lots of times when he's been sort of caught in the crossfire between, on the one hand, Francis, who's obviously more progressive, and on the other hand, people like the Archbishop Vigano. Not Archbishop Vinegar, Cardinal Vigano, who is sort of the unofficial, you know, king in exile of this sort of like anti-Francis movement, and you know, there have been a number of times when Benedict has basically been seen doing things in public that seem like they directly contradict Pope Francis. So the right-wingers, the critics, have made him into a kind of spiritual figurehead of their movement, even if he's not really into it himself. And then he's always sort of scrambling to disassociate himself from it. So there was a book where he was listed as a co-author that was, I think it was defending priestly celibacy. So one of Francis's big things is there's sort of this big question over whether he's going to sort of relax celibacy, because that obviously relates to the child abuse scandals. You know, arguably if priests could marry, they wouldn't go around, you know, noncing up kids or whatever. But obviously Benedict was seen as having defended this policy, right? No, sorry, as having defended celibacy. And that caused this major outcry, you know, ooh, he's allying himself with the traditionalists, he's meddling. So he had his name removed from the book. He said he never actually was a co-author. And you know, there are a number of other things where people are basically sort of, they cast him as this sort of, you know, the authentic sort of Holy Father, whereas who's and specifically they say his resignation. There are some people, very, 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 you know, sort of narrow clique of people who say that his resignation was a fraud and wasn't valid, and that basically Francis is a pretender, so what you call an anti-pope if you're talking in like sort of 13th century terms. But I mean, as someone pointed out to me, the idea of an anti-pope is ridiculous. I mean, it came about, you know, it was a medieval concept when people, you know, when you know, if you were living in New York, for instance, you didn't know and you know, and some guy was sort of going around claiming to be the Pope. His claim could be plausible, you know, because you don't have the data to draw on to see who's actually residing in the Holy See at any given point. Whereas if I declare myself Pope now, I think people will be able to sort of quite quickly verify that I'm not the Pope. And
I believe it.
You believe Ben's the Pope?
I believe almost anything.
Yeah, well, you're gullible. No, but I think what's
maybe
worth
I am the Pope.
what's worth unpacking a little bit is this broader the context, because not everyone watching is like well schooled on Catholic history or what's been going on in the last few years. So this sort of anti-Pope idea, it's part of this deep church. I would call, that's what I guess we're calling it, the deep conspiracy. It's very analogous to the deep state conspiracy theory in terms of politics. I did find it funny that like Benedict's funeral was on January 5th, so this was like it's not so much election denial, but it was Ben's gone. I don't know where there is. It's not so much election denial, but I guess the traditional Catholics who never recognized Francis or deny his ascendance, there is this election denial thing. Of course, the Ben might be able to tell me more about it, because I'm not, even though I am a kind of crappy Catholic, I'm not sure of the process. But electing the new Pope is a very complex consensus protocol, no less, because you have to have total consensus, right? Is that right, Ben?
Yeah.
It's like with the smoke and like they wait for hours, and you have to have all the kind of cardinals have to agree, or at least unanimous. So it's not even consensus. It's not a majority. You have to have like all the cardinals agree. Oh, you're mute.
Yeah, I don't think all of them have to agree. I believe it's a majority of some sort.
So it's 51%.
I don't remember exactly what the percentage would be, but I think it is some kind of majority.
Okay, but it's a medieval. I mean, it's a very
archaic. If there's a split, they can do a coalition and have two popes at once.
No, that's a joke, right?
Yeah, no,
you can't. But anyway, the point is that this faction never accepted that Pope Francis was legitimate, and they have been treating Benedict as the de facto Pope. Now he's dead. What happens next? Like, this is the big intrigue.
Well, this is interesting. So there's it's worth probably mentioning the Sede Vacantista movement. So since the 1960s, so in the 1960s, there was basically obviously like huge sort of like progressive movements, sexual liberation, and all that stuff. And during that period, there was also the Second Vatican Council, which basically sort of, to put it in like the most simplistic terms, it basically made the papacy a bit more progressive, right? And it opened it up to certain, like, they changed the idea of salvation basically to include the possibility of salvation and grace for, a wider array of people. And in that context, a lot of conservatives basically abandoned the church, and they sort of, retroactively came up with this conspiracy theory that was it John the 23rd, who was the Pope at the time, was illegitimate. Because he was a Freemason, basically, and Freemasons aren't supposed to ascend to the papacy.
Was he?
So,
is that confirmed?
I actually don't know. I don't know. I mean, I just kind of assume that because it's part of the conspiracy that it's just not true. But I don't know. But basically, yeah, he. Whether or not he was a Freemason, there's this movement that's been going on since the 1960s that basically holds every single occupant of the Holy See as just invalid, and it produces quite a few sort of theological problems as well, because like there isn't really a way to rectify it, because you hold another conclave, all the cardinals who are convening to anoint the new pope, they've been anointed by the previous pope who was legitimate. So every cardinal is illegitimate because they've been appointed by legitimate popes. So basically, there's no way around this. There's no way to restore the papacy short of, basically a miracle, But But what happened after Benedict's retirement? So the sedevacantista movement, literally sedevacante, which means vacancy. The Santa Sede is what it's called in Italian. So like the Holy See is vacant. That's the idea. After Benedict retired suddenly and abruptly, he was like the first in 600 years to do so. There was another movement that basically sort of an even more fringe version of the sedevacantista movement called benevacante, which was this idea that he didn't truly resign, that he was made to do it, coerced to do it by shadowy, like, neoliberal forces or whatever. And then Francis the Pretender was installed in his place. So out of this context arises this huge sort of Vatican culture war with roots, it has roots to the 60s, to this Vatican Council movement, but it also sort of has been given a fresh run by Francis's sort of rule, which has been more explicitly progressive than anything since the Second Council. You had people like Pope John Paul II who are sort of like perceived as Reaganites, so they didn't cause that much controversy among the right. But right now it's it's full blown war, right? Because he's not sort of giving in to these crusty traditions that have sort of dominated the papacy for 2,000 years or whatever. And he's whether you think he's good or not, he's certainly acting much more independently than any other pope before him.
So Josh, do you have any views on what Ben said?
Well, I mean, I think it's the sedevacante movement, or it's something like it. Is that the one that Mel Gibson is part of?
I think so.
Which one is he?
I think that's Mel Gibson's tribe. And
I think we have like Luke Dash Jr. in Bitcoin. He's a programmer. He's one of these guys as well.
I once interviewed him. He about eating pets. I think he eats pets.
What?
He was speaking out in favor of eating pets, basically, because he said they're no different to eating a chicken or eating a cow or anything.
Like your dog.
Well, it was kind of the logical extreme of the sort of Bitcoiner diet thing, where they don't eat seed oils and they eat only steak. And he was thinking, well, God, he told me that God put animals on earth to serve us, right? And so there's no distinction to really be made between a chicken and a cat. It's just that we have a sort of superficial affection for cats because we're weak, basically. So the strong and rational thing is to.
That's because you're weak, Isabella.
Because you're weak.
You're a weak person. I love Luke.
If you had any courage, you would take. Do you have any pets?
Me? Yeah. I left her at the doggy daycare this morning.
You've just outed yourself now as not being.
You already outed me.
What are you going to say? I thought you were going to say you left her in the fridge.
I put her on ice when I leave.
But yeah, so it's fascinating because this whole mythology is it is a culture war within the Catholic system. A lot of the stuff is coming from America. I think Vigano has a big American following. Vigano is is he a cardinal or a bishop? I'm not sure.
He's a cardinal for sure.
But he's one of the guys who's very much proliferating this idea that that the current Catholic system is not legitimate. That he's almost like a sort of Vatican in exile at this point. I'm surprised he hasn't been excommunicated by Francis, actually.
We don't really do that anymore.
They don't do that anymore?
So he basically tried to, early on in Francis's papacy, he basically tried to sort of expose him and have him completely tar his reputation. Vigano tried to tar Francis's reputation. Basically, he released these files, right? This huge dossier that supposedly showed that Francis had sort of failed to, he'd covered up the abuse of this Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, right? And there was this huge scandal, right? And it probably could have like severely harmed Francis' reputation, if not for the fact that Vigano basically asked him to resign. He was urging him publicly to resign, which actually produces a sort of theological sort of conundrum, because a pope can only resign on his own terms, right? So having been asked to resign, he can't do it. So Vigano basically ended up completely discrediting himself by releasing this dossier and asking Pope Francis to resign. And ever since, he's just sort of become like, he's I don't know, he's a bit like Gulen, you know, the sort of the Turkish Erdogan critic who's out in hiding in like Philadelphia or whatever and writing all these screeds and sort of being accused of orchestrating, you know, military coups in Istanbul. But, you know, he's probably not really doing anything. I think Vigano's the same. He's holed himself up in a bunker somewhere in Michigan or whatever the hell. And he's spewing a lot of bile and he's saying a lot of things, but I think he really doesn't have much power. He's already made his big shot, and there's not really any way he can follow it up, because I mean, how do you follow that up? So yeah, I don't know.
Sorry, I accidentally muted you, but Josh, you were very excited about this story, and I want to know why you were so excited about this story.
Well, I like chaos more than anything. And I think it's really interesting when there's a bunch, like the Tradcasts, I think have been given very little the last few years, other than just kind of like sitting and watching and wishing that Benedict were still the Pope. And he, or well, you know, I guess he was the Pope, but like, I don't know what you'd call it, not the Pope Emeritus. I don't know what his position officially would have been, but I think it's just like the church has not had, I think, as much trouble as it's had in the last like 50 years, and it is a giant force. And I think particularly in the U.S., people don't realize how much power the Catholic Church has, or at least has had in the past, or will continue to have in the future, depending. And I just find I find the chaos to be really intriguing, especially given that Benedict and Francis really represent sort of, I think, the same fight that much of the world is having right now between like wokeism and sort of traditionalism. Francis being sort of a trope of wokeness, and yet still a very independent, fairly traditional guy. Benedict being like old school pre-Vatican II type traditionalism. And that's really interesting to me. That there's,
I think
this,
that's
like,
that is really interesting. It ties with what Ben was telling me. Like Ben, because you were giving me some really interesting insight about how this idea that Francis is this progressive pope isn't quite right. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, it's not so much that he's not progressive. It's more that just in the context, you know, compared to what we now consider, you know, progressives to be, you know, most of his views still sort of come from the Middle Ages. I mean, I went to this exorcism conference, and you know, it's fully authorized and sanctioned by Pope Francis, and they're just going around like sort of very soberly discussing how to remove the devil from someone whose eyes have rolled back and gone black, and who's people who are, you know, spewing black bile and speaking in tongues, and you know, and you know, and was it just yesterday, basically, I think there was this news that he's sort of now said that being gay isn't a sin, but I mean, this comes after years and years of, you know, dithering and sort of
he said it's
still not really
not a crime, right?
So right. He said it's not a crime, but he wasn't clear on whether it's a sin. And like, so I mean, when you're looking at this stuff, everything has to be sort of taken relatively, because nothing Francis does by the standard of any liberal is in any way woke at all. You know, okay, he rails against capitalism, and he talks about, you know, protecting migrants and like, you know, so on those fronts, he's more of a socialist in terms of his outlook. You know, he's mostly eschewed sort of identity politics and the stuff that we associate with wokeness. Really, he's sort of an old school like class warrior, if anything. You know, he came from Argentina. He fought the military into.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think that for me is another fascinating thing, is a large portion of the sort of socialist movement in the Catholic Church was sort of quelled and quashed back under like John Paul, and particularly the Central American and South American parts of that movement were really sort of condemned and booted out. and it's sort of weird to see a person who persists in some of that ideology to be the Pope now. And meanwhile, the emeritus Pope is like the opposite, completely the opposite of that, and is one of the most eloquent writers of the modern age in terms of someone who's taken that office.
Yeah, because Francis obviously came.
Uh-oh.
He was a Jesuit.
Then you're muted.
Sorry. Sorry, Ben. I just muted you for a
Oh,
you
no,
were
go on,
muted
go on,
just
go on.
to reduce the feedback. I'll just finish saying that Francis obviously was a Jesuit, and Jesuits in South America are famous for pushing or advancing liberation theology, which
Correct.
Josh, I'm sure you know more about than me. But that's like the socialist arm of the Catholic Church, based on the kind of Jesuit philosophy, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. And I believe, I don't know which encyclical it was, but I think there's an encyclical where it was basically condemned and sort of, thrown out, saying that this was not really an okay teaching within the church, particularly. I mean, I think it was JP2 was very anti-communist, right?
Well,
and then
I mean, here we have the perfect representation here, because we've got a Pole, a South American kind of American South American hybrid, and we've got Ben in Rome. So I'll do the JP bit. So JP, John Paul II, or Carol Vitola, as we call him, he was an anti-communist, and I think that was, he famously, I think the Polish church was always at loggerheads with communism. Communists were mostly pro-atheism. They barely tolerated the church. If they tolerated anyone, it was the Jesuits, because they saw the Jesuits as more aligned. So the Catholic schools that were allowed to kind of proliferate in Poland during communism were the Jesuit ones, as far as I understand. So John Paul II ascending to the papacy, it was a big thing. And this, of course, links to some of this schism stuff, because it links into the Fatima prophecies. And the Fatima prophecies are actually very key to this deep church schism, because I think in 1917, these 3 peasant children in Portugal saw an apparition of Mary. It's a very famous Marian thing, and she predicted something like, if you don't consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, then nations will disappear. And I'm doing terrible paraphrasing of this, but something of that sort. She predicted all hell for everybody.
Russia
right?
will spread its errors across the world or something.
That was it. Russia would spread its errors across the world. And this was interpreted by some as being indicative of Lenin and the beginnings of communism. And so it became very controversial, this idea of consecrating Russia. And John Paul II ended up doing it, but for diplomatic reasons. He didn't do it quite right. And a lot of people said, oh, no, you didn't fulfill the prophecy. You had to have every bishop and every cardinal, whatever, doing it at the same time, exactly, blah, blah, blah. And so there was this big question over whether it was done right. But on top of that, one of the children, the 2 others died, but one was called Sister Lucy. And Sister Lucy took a vow of becoming a nun, or whatever you do. And real Catholics are going to be appalled with my explanation of this. But she ended up writing down the secrets that Mary told her, and she wasn't allowed to release them, I think, until after the 60s. And she wrote down 3 secrets. And the first 2 they did reveal, and they I can't remember now. There was something innocuous. And then the 3rd one they held back, and it became hugely significant. Everyone is speculating, what's the 3rd secret of Fatima? And then Benedict, when he ascended to the papacy, he allegedly released the 3rd secret, and it was a real letdown. It was something to do with like some weird vision of a pope walking up a mountain and getting shot, or not shot, but there was some soldiers. It was weird. And this was interpreted. Huh?
It was Blitzlaser.
Yes,
it was the equivalent. It was the equivalent of that obscure Russian exchange that the
yes.
Securities and Exchange Commission recently sued or something.
So, but so the official interpretation of the vision was that it predicted the assassination attempt on John Paul II. And that was it, done and dusted. But the tradcaths and the people who thought there was like apocalyptic visions and true secrets in it, they've never accepted that this was the real secret. They've always said that it was held back and it's not been properly revealed. And I think this intrigue has created a sort of moral justification for the idea that Fatima, the consecration also never happened, right? And so funnily enough, when the Ukraine war broke out in February, this all escalated again. And actually the Ukrainian Orthodox, the Ukrainian Catholic priests and bishops or whatever it is, this is terrible. I'm such a bad Catholic. They requested that Francis does the ceremony again, just in case it was done wrong, because they saw it as actually the invasion as indicative of the fact that the consecration never properly happened and we had to redo it and get it right. And they did it, and Francis actually did it. So now Putin has tapped into this prophecy, and actually there's a weird spin on it, because if you believe the other side, Putin is actually there are some elements, as far as I understand, we've lost Ben. Oh, there he is. Some elements have now spun this to say that actually Russia was properly consecrated, and now Russia is going to save the world from the errors that spread through communism. So that's the current two interpretations of the.
But like, is that sort of reputable people, or is that like Popehead?
Yeah, it's not just Popehead. It's
I mean, maybe there's no difference.
It's those guys, you know. It's the Sedi Vatican. How do you pronounce it? Sedi Vacantes.
Well, there's something you said before, which was about John Paul II being sort of seen as this Reaganite. What's interesting is, similar to how Benedict has been sort of miscast a little bit, John Paul II, so he wrote this encyclical that was quite famous, where it looked like he really just defended the free market system, you know, without reserve. But he was actually sort of motivated to edit certain things, or like leave out his actual thoughts, or certain other parts where there were these two sort of American Catholics who sort of were very influential in sort of influencing him when he wrote it. And if you actually read the encyclical itself, he does actually mention, you know, that the free markets are good, and then he'll say like within limits,
the
within
unbridled
reason.
capitalism encyclical.
Yeah. the one that advocates for like pump and dump schemes within reason.
Within reason. He talks about how capitalism is good. Unbridled capitalism, however, can be a great evil.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
but
the free
that
market
seems
is a thrill, but like, you know what an even bigger thrill is? You know, our Lord and Savior.
Oh, nice. But John Paul II obviously did help through the Catholic network. They did help bring down communism. There's no doubt that the Catholic system was used as a fifth column.
Yeah, but that doesn't make him a sort of like, you know, like dyed in the wool anarcho-capitalist, or like Reaganite, or like free marketeering crusader. He was still more cautious in his sort of support for capitalism, but obviously he was still against sort of at least Soviet communism. Like, I'm not saying he was a socialist or anything, but even his own sort of endorsement of capitalism was sort of ginned up by his by the more conservative sort of elements, in the same way that Benedict himself, like, he did have some more conservative views than Francis, for sure, but he wasn't the sort of figurehead that they painted him as. He was much more moderate and much more reasonable, and much more boring than having read his book.
But also, it's worth pointing out that Poland itself, like when it was independent, before it became, you know, in that brief period of independence in the interwar period, it was sorry, I just muted you for feedback reasons. It was very divided. So there was a very strong right wing and a very strong left wing, and it was pretty much as divided as it is today. And depending on which side you took, it was, you know, I would imagine that John Paul II wouldn't have been entirely like radical leftist or radical right wing, because as a reflection of Polish society, he had to appeal to both sides, and there was a definite divide there. But what about, the fifth column idea, and how it applies to today is that I was doing this unheard thing yesterday with Konstantin from Trigonometry, which is it's quite, I don't watch it, but maybe you know it. And he's Ukrainian, he's Russian Ukrainian, and he was presenting a very nuanced opinion about wokeism in general, and saying that his audience doesn't really appreciate the fact that he's very pro Ukraine, and he was saying that in that context, you have to have nuance. It can't, there's an element in the anti-woke movement that is very binary. Like if the Guardian says this is good, we must say it's bad, and if it's a bit absurd. So they end up being pro-Russia, even though logically they should be Ukrainian sovereignty and the fight for nationalist sort of identity is traditionally quite a right-wing idea. So what he was saying, though, is that the spin on the fact that Zelensky has banned the Russian Orthodox Church, that has been incredibly overhyped. It is true that he banned it, but that's fair enough in war, because the Russian Orthodox Church was genuinely being used in Ukraine as a fifth column of the Russians. So what are you going to do? And there is a sort of reluctance on the pro-Ukraine side to acknowledge the fact that this was justifiable in the context of war, and they're kind of pussyfooting around a little bit as a result. But I thought that was interesting because it is analogous to how the Catholic Church was used as a fifth column to bring down communism. So Putin is kind of doing the same thing to Ukraine, what Pope John Paul did to the Soviet Union, if that makes sense. Go on, Ben. Sorry.
Oh no, I've got nothing. I'm just taking it in.
And do you know some of these tradcast guys like Popehead? I know he's there in Vatican as well. You run into them?
I assumed Popehead was the man himself. I mean,
no, but Ben did go to the gladiator school. That's really interesting. You wrote a piece about that. That's kind of linked into this intrigue, isn't it? Because Steve Bannon, Steve Bannon wanted to revive the tradcaf thing, and he was going to build this sort of. Well, you tell the story, Ben.
American Catholic conservatives and I guess some English ones as well are deeply invested in the war against Francis, and Steve Bannon used to sort of spend a lot of time going to conferences there and sort of Zoom calling with all the sort of dark Vatican cardinals and stuff like that. And he met this guy called Benjamin Harnwell, and Harnwell is a really interesting person. He used to work in Brussels, and he founded this thing under this conservative MEP called Nersh Deva. And while he was in Brussels, he founded this think tank called the Institute Dignitas Humanae or something, which literally translates it's pretentiously in Latin, but it means the Institute of Human Dignity. And he's one of these people who believes that Western Judeo-Christian values have basically been allowed to atrophy over the last, say, half century or something. And together with Bannon, basically, having left Brussels and moved to Rome, he decided to found in this ancient monastery called Trizulti, which is in the mountains of central Italy, near a beautiful tiny little hilltop town called Bardo, right? He basically founded this putative kind of what he called a gladiator school, the Academy for the Judeo-Christian West. And the idea was basically that they would train sort of would-be sort of politicians and populists of the far right to not only the idea wasn't just to train them in the dark, Catholic conservative arts, teaching them theology and stuff, but it was mostly designed to teach them how to better present the ideas that they already have in the context of a leftist dominated press, So they'd be taught all these sort of conservative talking points. I'm trying to think of one. There was one which was there were sort of sound bites, ways of presenting an anti-abortion argument better. So women may have the right to choose, but they also have the right to choose life. Sort of quirky little sound bites like that. The school basically never took off because Harnwell basically credits it to like left-wing conspiracy theories and like insane stuff like that. But
but there's a bunch of schools like that around the world. There's been a movement of that sort of thing for the last probably 30 years. The most prominent being Campus Crusade for Christ's establishment of a college in New York City called the King's College. You're muted.
I have not heard of the King's College. I mean,
there
you are.
The King's College. Are you there?
Like, what does it do? What's its thing?
Same exact mission. The mission is to train up. It's supposed to. The goal was to make a Christian college that was equivalent to like the Ivy Leagues or something like that, and then send Christians into places of leadership, particularly politics. And it's more. I mean, it's not Catholic; it's evangelical, but it's exactly the same type of thing. So this is kind of a popular thing to do. It has been for the last 30 years, and just kind of try to establish these. And it's actually kind of interesting. Like at the King's College, they had a lot of buy-in. So people like Peter Kreeft actually were professing there and such. There's a lot of fairly large names. Peter Wood, the columnist, is a big one. And at one time, Dinesh D'Souza was president of the college and had an inglorious fall when he cheated on his wife. So there's a bunch of
an evangelical?
Yeah. Wait, is who?
Dinesh D'Souza.
Oh yeah, he's an evangelical. Peter Kreeft isn't.
Know much about. Don't really know.
Peter Kreeft is not an evangelical. He's like a staunch Catholic.
All right. It's interesting. It's interesting how I guess the evangelicals, they're more sort of decentralized, aren't they? Like they don't really have a sort of focal point, whereas the Catholics, they all basically look to Rome. I guess obviously because of this sort of it's also got this history, obviously being the cradle of Western civilization and all that. But also being the center of Christendom. So Rome has sort of become this place to do politics and like sort of glad hand if you're a right-wing conservative guy and try and like influence, or it's a place where you think you can influence. I think this is Bannon's problem. He sort of made a lot of contacts with high-profile cardinals and people like that in Rome, and sort of like went around like doing the rounds, making friends, but nothing really came of it because you can't really make waves in the Vatican if you're an outsider. But you
Also,
know, you have people like
saying,
as well.
Sorry, you were saying that Italy is also very transparently either communist or fascist, right? There isn't the same sort of like people are just transparently X or Y, and the society just accepts it, right? That's what you were saying earlier to me?
There's an element of truth in that, like. The fascists you get in Italy aren't, in America, if you like wear a MAGA hat, you're called a fascist, or if you like own a truck or something, you're a fascist. Whereas here, like you might well be a genuine fascist. Your grandfather might have been like, like strong
Italian fascists, the real fascists.
Yeah, he might have been like, like as undersecretary to like Mussolini or something. So it's whereas the communists, Italy basically had the biggest communist party in the Western world until like 1980, until the early 90s. So if you say you're a communist, you might genuinely be a communist. I mean, there are places with really storied communist tradition like you don't get in any other Western country. I don't know, maybe France a little bit, but I mean like in the really recent future. But I don't know what was there something more specific you wanted to know?
I can't remember why I mentioned it, but obviously, like in terms of, I think in terms of the kind of context of Bannon coming into Italy and thinking he can sort of cultivate a movement, I guess he was tapping into the more right wing element, right? But of course, Italy is also in the grips of the mafia. Where do they fall? They're not communists, right? But the mafia's origins are also quite working class in some ways.
Definitely fascist either. The fascists cracked down on the mafia. They probably did the best job of sort of ridding them, but also the Communist Party in the I can't remember when exactly, but in the mid sort of 20th century, the Communist Party they basically had a lot of influence at the grassroots level in a lot of southern places. So like they were able to also combat the mafia and sort of help people get out of it and and resist. So the mafia occupies a kind of grey zone. It's not right wing, it's not left wing, it's its own thing. Cosa Nostra, right? It's literally its own thing. And the recent arrest of this guy Matteo Messina Denaro, he was part of this sort of faction in the Cosa Nostra in the 90s, which tried actively to sort of challenge the state. It tried to turn itself into a sort of regional, like a sovereign power, right? And then it was eventually crushed because it went too far. But I'm trying to think if there are any with the mafia to the Vatican.
Well, while we have you here, it would be really cool to get your a quick explainer, because I'm sure Josh has no idea about it. Like, what's the kind of structure of the Italian political scene at the moment? So we know that Meloni has, allegedly a fascist, has taken over control. Everyone freaked out about it. But that was very much, the only people surprised about it were non-Italians, right? And but there is a more. Oh, hi. Are you still there?
Sorry.
No,
sorry. It just keeps cutting off. But yeah, sorry, carry on.
No, it's okay. But also, there's this broader kind of, from Berlusconi to the Draghis of this world and the 5-star movement. Just give us a picture of like the madness of Italian politics. I think it's worth just getting that through.
Yeah, all right. So you really have to go back to the 90s to understand it. So like, well, even the Second World War. I mean, really, the fall of the Roman Republic, if we really want to understand it. No, so basically, after the Second World War, very briefly, there were two main parties, basically two main political blocs. There was Christian democracy, which was basically sort of like the centre-left establishment, and then the perennially sort of suppressed Communist Party, which was huge but never actually got to office. Like, there was a sort of compromise in the 70s where they sort of had some more power, but they ultimately basically were never in office. Christian democracy basically had all of these dragged along with it, all of these sort of other sort of smaller factions which sort of clung on, and like and it basically held on to coalitions until the mid-90s, where it was just completely exposed as having been this clientelist mess of like bribes and kickbacks and mafia connections and all sorts of malfeasance, right? So basically every almost like, I swear, something like half or even more than half of the sitting MPs in the in Christian democracy, which had been the sole sort of like ruling coalition leader since the end of the Second World War, almost all of them were implicated in bribery scandals or whatever, and the members of their coalition parties as well. So like Bettino Craxi, he was the big guy in the Socialist Party, which was allied to the Christian democracy. And so basically the entire political establishment just collapsed in the 90s. And it was funny, like out of that sort of mess emerged Berlusconi, a guy called Umberto Bossi, who was the founder of the League. So a lot of people think of the League as this sort of recent development, Salvini and all that, but the League actually emerged in the 90s. And also from the fallen Communist Party, which wasn't exposed as this sort of as a clientelist mess, but basically just disbanded after the fall of the Berlin Wall, because it was kind of just seen as a bit embarrassing being associated with it anymore, as well as like obviously much more complex factors. Out of the Communist Party arose the Democratic Party. And so it's a weird one. It's really, really, really hard to piece together. But basically, all of these competing factions basically tried to like claim the neutral ground of like clean and good politics. We're not going to be like the old guys. Obviously, every single one of them ended up being exposed in their own bribery scandals. So this first wave of sort of post-collapse, they called it Bribesville. So the first wave of sort of post-Bribesville parties all wound up being implicated in scandals themselves, even having built their platforms on challenging the corruption of the previous political class. So Berlusconi, his whole tenure was basically characterized by scandals. He didn't really do anything except like sell off all the national sort of assets to private companies, whatever. So there was just endless malaise basically until the mid-noughties. No, was it the mid-noughties? No, I think it was 2013. I think when basically at that point there'd basically been a back and forth, an endless back and forth between Berlusconi and the post-communist Democratic Party, which was a lot of the communists who are part of that party. Am I making sense? I can slow down, by the way.
No, keep going. But like, so just
we're getting to the present.
Yeah.
Basically, a lot of the communists in the Communist Party overcompensated and became like super pro free markets and all that stuff. So they ended up forming this Democratic Party, which sort of ended up going into power, like, roughly every other year to Berlusconi, and that just proved to be just as sort of useless and unproductive as all of the previous parties have been. So out of that rose, you have 5-star, and then
well, explain the 5-star philosophy, because there was like an algorithm there was like tied to these computational ideas, right? Because everything that humans had tried to do in Italy was so disappointing. So 5-star tried to do the ultimate kind of technocratic, party solution. Is that right?
Yeah, basically. So because the political class was so sort of awful and corrupt, there was this dreamer, this guy called Gianroberto Casaleggio. He basically tries to build a new party that wouldn't be a party, be a movement, and it'd be anti-political. And his whole platform was basically just like being anti-politicians. It didn't really have any just concrete policies or anything, but it began.
Antipo.
Yeah, and it kind of began on like this app meetup in like 2013, and people just crowd in squares and basically just say like "fuck off" to the establishment. That was basically it. It was just complete, sort of just this sort of outcry of rage and anger, and it didn't really have any sort of political. There wasn't really any way to properly channel it. But eventually, it ran a few of its members for like local offices and mayorships and stuff like that, and eventually it just managed to sort of inveigle itself into high office. And that was concurrent with the rise of the League, the re-rise of the League. So the League had emerged from the 90s, but the League sort of sagged a bit, disappeared a bit, and then re-emerged under Salvini, and with the same sort of populist momentum behind it. And then so what happened was the League and 5-star eventually ended up forming a coalition government together, which, because it wasn't a very effective government, really, ended up basically discrediting both parties, which leads to basically the COVID era. Everything's going to shit, nothing's working. And then you have Mario Draghi, former European Central Bank chief, who is basically just sort of installed because he's considered the only competent man left in Italy, basically. So he's kind of just installed to clear up the mess left by the last 20 years of sort of politicking. He doesn't really manage to fix anything either, but he's also part of a long trend of technocrats just being inserted to clean up the mess left by the populists, basically. And then he doesn't achieve anything. And then all of the people who allied themselves with him, so the League, 5-star, all of these people who had previously claimed to be different and sort of independent and not part of the establishment had allied themselves with Draghi, tarred themselves in doing so, lost credibility, leaving room for the only sort of politician who wasn't allied with Draghi and who was still sort of playing to a far right, playing to sort of populist grievances, and that was Meloni, who is whose party, Brothers of Italy, is a spin-off of a party founded directly by sort of Mussolini loyalists in the post-war years. I think that was a way too long explanation, but that's basically everything that's happened in Italy.
It is fascinating though, because it sort of says to me that this is what happens to democracy. Like after a while, you just get Italian chaos, and the but this is like, I studied ancient history. So this is the sort of the same circumstances, the total chaos of the Roman Republic eventually gives way to the people wanting a dictator, because the dictator at least promises some sort of like order and consistency. And after a while, like that seems like a good option in the context of all that madness.
But then what happens is the security ends up depending on that one person. And then that one person either, they resign, they leave office, leaving a mess behind, or they sort of try and just develop an authoritarian kind of like personal rule.
Well, then it becomes a question of succession, and like how do you maintain the legitimacy of handing it down to another authoritarian. And obviously the deepest ironies about Italy's alleged aversion to kingship, like the whole system, obviously, of democracy that they themselves innovated, because Roman democracy was very different to Greek democracy, stems from this hatred of kingship. And yet they keep, at the end of the day, maybe it's something in the Italian psyche. There's just so much. I mean, look, anyone who's ever been on Alitalia, you kind of, I end up wishing for a dictator. It's the chaos. I've never been on an Alitalia flight that landed in the destination that I was supposed to be going to.
Are you sure?
Is it because of strikes?
No, it was the right. Like they always are.
Is that because
strike.
Yeah, is it strikes?
By a gust of wind.
It's either a gust of wind. There's like, I get diverted. They cancel that flight. They have to, like, oh, you can't go to Rome. You'll have to go to Milan, and then we'll bus you over.
They're like saying it like mid-flight, like, sorry, we've just changed destination.
Sometimes it happened to me once, like when I was supposed to be landing in Milano, and I ended up having to land in Linate, which is okay. That's not the worst case scenario, but it's a bit annoying.
Did they offer the opportunity to parachute out while they were passing Milan?
Sadly not. No, it's not like having a bus that and a driver who lets you out. No, but just Josh, what's your what's your take on all that? Like, how informed
European
are you
politics are so weird. It feels like I'm very American, so like I have a sense of sort of this republic that we've built, and I have like a good sense of its dysfunction. But Italian politics is always Italian and Spanish politics in particular, I think, have always seemed to be utterly dysfunctional to me, and it amazes me that they're able to have functioning governments.
And yet,
that what keeps it functioning is kind of just a vast bureaucracy that basically just does everything on behalf of the ministers, because half the time the ministers don't really even know what they're doing. They're new to politics because there's a new populist party every year.
Per the greater discussion, I think what's interesting is the Italian form of government has really built up over the last 1,000 years, right? And it's built around like this sort of notion of having like a government within the government, and it seems sympathetic to that in some ways, but like all of the ways in which like Italy has sort of forked off and done things with its government, whether it's fascism or whatever, or communism, any type of thing seems to like at least somehow incorporate the notion of like the Vatican, or at least it's such a big political aspect of like Italian politics. It's just very interesting to me how
it's I mean, it's really because Italy was basically unified in the 1860s, right? And it's basically been trying to be a real country since. I don't know if you've read Pinocchio, but like this will be relevant. Basically,
like the original Pinocchio?
The original, yeah.
I've read that. I have read that.
The dark and gritty original Pinocchio. But basically, the idea behind it, right, was like, so after Italy was unified, there was this famous quote by I think the then like education minister or whatever, who said, "Now we have made Italy, we need to make Italians," right? So this Pinocchio sort of illustrates that story. It was a very sort of its time. It was about this sort of this ill-formed sort of like hunk of wood that needs to become a legitimate sort of person, right? And it's this striving to sort of create a sort of unified identity that basically defines the whole of the sort of pre and post-war like Italian era. So that's why it ends up being this laboratory for basically these in political experiments, because this is a country that has been divided for 2,000 years into these tiny little territories, and it's looking for meaning, and it's searching for meaning in figures like Mussolini but in sort of higher, more loftier sort of abstract ideals like communism and anarchism, and then you have
you're right. I mean, like up until
democracy or whatever, like
through the 16th century even, you have Italian essentially like little kings of like the entire country's kind of split up, and it's being jockeyed for by countries all over the world. I don't know if it was that late, but 16th.
No. I mean,
16th
it was
century,
literally
17th
like
century.
that. It was like that until the 1860s. So after the fall
Yeah.
of the Roman Empire until the 1863, Italy was like basically a collection of fiefdoms. It was just, and that.
Yeah.
It was being trampled on by its neighbors, especially the Austrians, but also the French and the Spanish, and basically everyone. Everyone wanted a piece of Italy. The only sort of sovereign sort of province in Italy, which wasn't really even that sovereign, was the Papal territories. But they were always sort of. It was kind of like a sort of pre-industrial like Israel. Basically, it was like always sort of propped up,
and even
powerful friends.
And even the Pope in the medieval era would sort of divide up the territory and kind of command people to give their territory up to other countries.
He had what they call temporal power. He would just send like huge mercenary armies to like attack like Viterbo, Florence, or whatever, and he basically just acted as a kind of as just another warlord, but with this sort of veneer of like divine right.
It's just incredible. Like I think Italy's such a weird. I didn't know it was until the 1860s that it was split like that.
Yeah, I mean, even after the First World War, actually, this is where I get murky. The 20s is just a blind spot for me, really. But there was always, I mean, Italy actually extended itself basically through Istria, which is like sort of northeast Italy, so into what's it called, Fiume, which was this Italian, which is a Croatian city now, but like so there were points when it was sort of, there was a lot of interplay and a lot of territorial disputes with like Yugoslavia, also with Austria, even like relatively recently, like in the last century. In fact, Fiume is really interesting. This is a good side note if you want some great little a great little bit of intrigue. Fiume, after the First World War, so this city that's now Croatian, it was invaded by a bunch of what they called Arditi. It was like this sort of crack squadron of like Italian First World War soldiers, right? And leading them was this guy called Gabriele D'Annunzio, and he was the head of this sort of, he was the head of at least like one band of these Arditi. Arditi literally translates to the daring ones, right? So they were sort of the celebrated like sort of war heroes of the First World War who fought in the Alps against the Austrians and all that stuff. And he basically managed to capture this city of Fiume, right? And he basically took over it. He was also a poet. He wrote sort of Oscar Wilde-esque sort of like novels about like comic novels about like just the decadent high life in Rome. But then he became this sort of this sort of Croatian warlord. And he basically, while he was running things in Fiume, it was like quite a few years, I think, he basically invented the branding that would become the hallmark of fascism. Like he was the first to sort of salute from a balcony, and he had all this sort of like lofty rhetoric about like like blood and glory and Caesar and all that stuff, and harking back to the halcyon days of the Roman Empire and all that stuff. And Mussolini was like directly inspired by him. And so this idea of the fact that he was in Fiume in Croatia, which wasn't Italian previously, was sort of again like it was Italians striving to return to the days when they just sort of ran the Mediterranean, when they could just extend their reach as far as Gibraltar in the west and whatever, the Euphrates in the east, and like. But it's not going to happen again, is it?
Who knows? But I mean, it sounds like Afghanistan, basically, like tribal loyalties rather than national identity. Yeah. And but it's
without
like the European
poppies,
huh?
Without the poppies.
I don't know. I mean, they have,
and with less likable people.
With less likable.
Really?
No, Italians are. Oh, come on, they're chaos, but they're lovely. They're lovely. J'adore. No, that's French. I don't know.
You speak the language very well as well.
I don't speak the language, but a good place to wrap up though is on what was I going to say about Afghanistan and tribal loyalties? Siena, I think, is the epitome of this tribal system, corrupt system. Actually, there's this amazing horse race that happens every year. Do you know about it?
I lived for a year, my year abroad.
So Palio, Josh, have you heard of Palio?
No.
as a
Other than the diet.
No, not the diet. So it's called the Palio, and it involves all the houses of Siena racing. There's just one race. The horses, each rider represents one of the houses. But the most insane thing about it is that you know pretty much who's going to win it before it even happens, because it's not really an exercise. It's so corrupt. It's like it's
literally horse trading.
It's like it's worse than what's the European football people, the UEFA. It's worse than UEFA because it's an exercise in game theory, like who can bribe who enough to ensure that their house wins, and that is all you're betting on. And at the end of the day, I mean, you'd find it fascinating just from a game theory perspective. There was a good documentary about it ages ago.
Yeah, and there's also a bit of chaos in the mix because, like, basically, it's not necessarily the rider who wins. If the rider falls off his horse, the horse can win without him. So if the rider falls off and the horse, which isn't supposed to win, just decides to win anyway because the horse isn't aware of all the sort of horse dealing, the horse trading that's been going on before, then you've got a real problem on your hands. And, like, who's responsible?
It's a really fun thing to go and visit, though.
It's an amazing city.
And then on that bombshell, I think we'll wrap up for today, and we'll leave Josh to his merry ways, and I don't know which weird
home.
What?
At home.
At home, and yeah, exactly. That makes perfect sense. Also, the delay is driving me nuts. So sorry for the quality of the audio. It's I don't know whose internet it is, but it's a bit.
It's mine. Sorry, it's always mine.
It's okay. Oh, we'll blame it on
fascists. The fascists trying to do internet, and all the internet tells me that all these European countries are better.
Exactly. But Ben, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your further reporting on matters Vatican and Intrigue. Excellent stuff. Thank you very much.
Vatican correspondent Ben signing out.
Was an honor.
Okay, take care, guys. So we're wrapping up. Enjoy your week.
Cheers,
Take
Ben.
Care. Bye.
See you, Isabel.
Laters.